It's the 5th anniversary of the war in Iraq, and as much as any place in America, here in the South Sound, we've experienced pretty much everything that anyone else in the country could have. There are folks here who've been against it from the beginning. There are folks who, from the beginning and still, are foursquare behind it. The war for troops from Fort Lewis and McChord began in late December of '02 and January of '03, when a lot of units were notified that they were going to be sent. The biggest of these were the 62nd Medical Brigade from Fort Lewis and the Triple Nickel Engineer Brigade. And their trucks and helicopters and Humvees were all loaded up down at the port of Tacoma. No protesters that time. Other units also deployed. The 47th Combat Support Hospital was set up right near the Kuwait-Iraq border. The 864th Combat Engineer Battalion went up right up the front and they cut the berm for the 3rd Infantry Division, the leading elements of the invasion. And 40th Transportation Company hauled gas all over the country right at the beginning to keep all the tanks and trucks, Bradleys, fueled up. Colonel Bob Allardyce, the wing commander from McChord, led the mission to drop the paratroopers into northern Iraq and open up the second front. They landed in an airfield near Erbil. Most of those early units convoyed all the way to the north of the country, so the Triple Nickel went up to Tikrit, and the 62nd Medical Brigade wound up all the way up in Mosul. So when the war started at Fort Lewis, they had the 3rd Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division was nearly complete in its transformation from a heavy armor brigade into the wheeled striker brigade. And so in November of '03, it deployed with about 4,000 soldiers and their 300 plus strikers. The strikers spent about a month in Samarra and in Balad, then went up to take over in Mosul, a city of about 2 million people. While the strikers were in Iraq, the 81st Brigade combat team from the Washington National Guard got the news on very short notice that they also were going to be called up and sent to Iraq. It turned out to be the largest mobilization of National Guard troops in Washington since the Second World War. Those first strikers spent the better part of their year in Mosul and then were replaced by their comrades from Fort Lewis, the 1st Brigade, 25th Infantry Division. They went to Mosul and fell in on the 3rd Brigade's vehicles and took over in September and October. That transition happened at a time when the insurgency was really intensifying in northern Iraq. December 12, 2004 was by far the worst day of the war for the people around here. That was the day that a suicide bomber walked into the chow hall at Bab Marez in Mosul and detonated himself. 22 people were killed, 6 of them from Fort Lewis. And it came as such a shock because this attack occurred in the middle of a heavily guarded, supposedly secure military installation. It was very difficult for a lot of people to take. By October 2005, the 1st Brigade was coming home. Meantime, several other units at Fort Lewis were on their way back to Iraq for a second tour. In the spring and early summer of 2006, the 3rd Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division got ready for its return engagement to Iraq. In the weeks before they were ready to leave, a young lieutenant from the brigade, Aaron Wattada, called a press conference to announce that he wasn't going to deploy because he believed that the war was illegal and that participating in combat operations with the brigade might make him culpable for war crimes. Eventually, he would be court-martialed in February of 2007. The court-martial ended in a mistrial. The Army tried to move to have a retrial of that court-martial. Wattada's attorneys sued in federal court, and that's where it stands now. As for the 3rd Brigade, they started out in Mosul again, familiar territory, and so much of it seemed the same as it was before until late 2006 when U.S. military commanders in Iraq came upon a new strategy that would be to surge as many U.S. units into Baghdad as they could muster because they believed that Baghdad was the center of gravity in Iraq. And so they sent the bulk of 3rd Brigade down from Mosul into Baghdad, where for the next several months, units from 3rd Brigade would work in some of the toughest neighborhoods in the capital. In March of 2007, the 5th Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment was assigned to go up into Diyala province, which is where all the insurgents from Baghdad ran after the initial push of the surge. In June, their relief finally came. Most of the brigade moved up to Bakuba and launched what became known as Operation Arrowhead Ripper, one of several operations aimed at driving out, or capturing, or killing the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq. When 3rd Brigade got home, they were the first brigade in the Army to undergo 100% screening for mild traumatic brain injury, which had been identified by then in the media and among the healthcare people as the signature wound of the Iraq War. Over the next few months, almost all the units from Fort Lewis that are deployed to Iraq now will come home. So the post will go into the summer and fall of this year with a full house. In fact, that's what they're focusing on now, is what do they do now that they're going to have everybody home. There'll be competition for everything from training resources to parking spaces. In the meantime, it's not the same story for the Washington National Guard, where their 81st Brigade combat team is in the midst of planning and training for their return to Iraq